Hello, and welcome to The Charge Cycle, an electrifying new podcast on all things fleet electrification. I'm Todd Trauman, I'm the CEO of Emission Control. If you are a procurement manager, a fleet operator, or one of the millions of people tasked with a zero-emission deployment goal, this podcast is for you. We speak with industry experts, funding experts, OEMs, and many others to help you stay ahead of this enormous electrification shift underway. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Charge Cycle, an electrifying new podcast on all things fleet electrification. Today, we're talking about the newly implemented Washington Clean Fuel Standard. If you are a Washington-based clean fuel provider or have operations and are utilizing electric equipment in Washington, you are to benefit. But even if you don't, this program will still likely affect you. We'll talk about why. We'll also talk about how this program works, how it impacts other states with similar clean fuel standards, which is primarily California, Oregon, and British Columbia. We'll talk a little bit about food versus fuel and feedstocks, and importantly, we'll talk about other complementary programs and incentives that might be a good fit for you. Today, we're very lucky to be here with Joel Creswell. He's the Climate Policy Section Manager at the Washington State Department of Ecology, the entity that oversees the Washington Clean Fuel Standard. Joel is a climate policy expert with a background in environmental science and a career spanning the public, private, and academic sectors. His background includes a decade of environmental field research, federal positions at the US EPA, and positions in regional and state governments in Washington. In Joel's current role, he leads a team focused on a range of greenhouse gas mitigation programs, including, like I said, the Clean Fuel Standard, but also the Zero Emission Vehicles Program, the hydrofluorocarbon phase-down programs, and the Volkswagen settlement. Joel, welcome to The Charge Cycle.
Thanks, Todd. Happy to be here.
So, first things first, has the stress level gone up or down since January 1st?
Well, I would say our stress level has been pretty high as long as I have been at the Department of Ecology, but that's because we are getting a lot of great work to do. Our legislature and our governor have kept us very busy. So, we're a little stressed out, but because we're doing really good work.
Very exciting. And for the listener, just FYI, January 1st, 2023 was the implementation date of Washington's Clean Fuel Standard. So, no rest for the wicked, Joel. Really quick, just before we dive into heavily, gave a little bit of a bio on you, but from your own words, give us a little bit more about your background and ultimately how you arrived at the Department of Ecology.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So I'm a bit of a recovering environmental chemist. I actually have a PhD in aquatic biogeochemistry. I studied mercury cycling in the environment, kind of looking at, the global mercury cycle and how it gets in fish and how that is not good for people. So, that was all very interesting, and I was doing great work, but I noticed that a driver of a lot of the processes I was studying was climate change, and I didn't really feel like I was doing much about that. So I underwent a little bit of a career pivot, went out and spent some time in Washington, D.C., and did a science policy fellowship out there. Worked at the EPA and then in the House of Representatives, kind of cutting my teeth on science policy. And then came back to Washington because this is one of the states that is doing really interesting and cutting edge climate work. And I really wanted to be on the cutting edge, sort of crafting new policies and helping try those out for the rest of the country. And so here I landed. I actually first worked at the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, which is the regional air pollution control authority that oversees the greater Seattle area. That organization was actually in the process of crafting its own regional clean fuel standard. It would have been the first sub-state level clean fuel standard in the country.
Interesting.
It was super interesting. That effort got shut down later on by ruling at the state Supreme Court. And in the meantime, the Washington legislature tasked the Department of Ecology with doing it. And, it wasn't quite a 1-2, that I left the Clean Air Agency and came to Ecology, but pretty soon after I transitioned over and am now lucky enough to be the guy implementing clean fuels policy for the state.
Yeah, absolutely. In a cutting edge state, like you mentioned, one of the earliest to adopt something similar. And even better, you're doing something very in the local. That's the first I've heard of that, actually. Just quickly, what does the day-to-day right now look like for you as the Climate Policy Section Manager at Ecology?
Yeah, so the Clean Fuel Standard, as you mentioned, is one of a few programs that I oversee, but it is the biggest piece of work that I'm focused on day to day. Obviously, it's January 20th, so we're on day 20 of the Washington Clean Fuel Standard, and there's still a ton of work to do getting the program up and running. Of course, even though it's officially in effect and our IT platform is up, people are registering and we're approving accounts. There are some additional features of the IT platform that aren't available yet, like submitting new fuel pathway applications and credit trading and things like that we're still in the process of testing and bringing fully online. We're also issuing a lot of guidance documents. We've done some user trainings. So there's just a ton of work to do to really build out this program. We only had about a year and a half between when the bill passed and when we had to have the program up and running, and that's just not a lot of time to build a massive regulatory program in a new state.
Yeah, so I'd like to start there, actually. There's a lot of folks, certainly on the transportation side of things, that aren't widely familiar with clean fuel programs already. And so maybe just in broad strokes from you, can you maybe just talk about what this particular standard is, or what a clean fuel standard is, and how it might relate to the state?
Yeah, absolutely. So clean fuel standards are, I think, a really interesting and cool way to decarbonize transportation. In that it's a market-based policy that really lets fuel suppliers kind of decide on their own how they're going to make money as we transition to lower carbon fuels. So the way it works is that we set a carbon intensity standard every year. Our program happens to have a 2017 baseline, and then every year we set a standard that's a certain percent below that baseline. And then we take every fuel that's sold in the state and we assess its carbon intensity. Can talk more about what that is in a minute. But we give it a score, and if its carbon intensity is above the standard for that year, then it's going to get a deficit. And if it's below the standard for the year, it gets a credit. And then at the end of the year, anybody with deficits in their account is going to have to buy credits to zero those out. And so what that means is that producers of low carbon fuels are generating credits that they can sell. So that's their incentive to sell their fuels in Washington or to set up shop and make low carbon fuels here. Of course, low carbon fuels is anything from, ethanol to electricity to hydrogen. It's anything below that standard. And so in that way, it sort of sets the market incentives so that the fuel system can then kind of decarbonize itself.
A market-based approach here is the real takeaway for fuel production, but not only fuel production, right? Similar to some of the other styles, if you're a consumer of electricity or a consumer of hydrogen, you can also be a credit generator in this program?
That's correct, right. So when we say fuel, we really mean anything that moves a vehicle. And, vehicle also means a couple of different things. It could be a ferry boat. It could be, a tractor. It could, any number of things. And so, yeah, what we're doing is we're looking at the life cycle carbon intensity of those fuels. And when we say life cycle, what we really mean is, if you put gasoline in your car and you turn it on, that gasoline's burned and you have a tailpipe emission. But that's not all the emissions that went into that gallon of gasoline. There's the emissions to get the oil out of the ground, to get it to the refinery, to refine it, to truck it to the gas station, and then the emissions from your car. So we would look at all of that. But then you can also think about a kilowatt hour of electricity, and you kind of have the same thing. Maybe it's generated from coal. We don't have a ton of that in Washington, but there are still a few coal plants. So that coal has to be mined, taken to the power plant, burned, there's an emission there, and then, there's some transmission losses as that electricity gets to your vehicle, and then, the electricity is consumed to move your car. You could do the same thing looking at hydropower or solar power. So all of these things are going to have a carbon intensity score, and we reduce everything to these common units of grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. Sounds really in the weeds. All it means is emissions per unit of energy, and that's a way that we can compare across any fuel, whether it's liquid, gaseous, or electrons.
And is the right way to think about this is to incentivize the acquisition or purchase by bringing down the cost of liquid or natural fuels, liquid or gaseous renewable fuels, is to help those fuel producers bring down their own cost to produce that. And then simultaneously on the electricity side, the idea here is to bring down the cost ultimately of the fuel by incenting the consumer of the fuel to offset what they paid. A fair way to provide that.
Yep. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Classic economics says that if you incentivize something, you get more of it. And so, this is a way to incentivize these lower carbon fuels, and that both makes them more affordable and provides an incentive for the producers to supply more of them here.
Absolutely. So, these programs, as I've heard, don't get off the ground immediately. Washington is now the third out here on the West Coast to implement a program in the United States. Obviously, now British Columbia has had one for a while with some new electricity provisions there. But can you speak a little bit to maybe some of the challenges you guys faced specifically in Washington about getting this thing off the ground and implemented? Did you see the same sort of kicking and screaming maybe as was seen in other states?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully not too much kicking and screaming, but it was a long effort. Washington started looking into a clean fuel standard over a decade ago. You can sort of dig back through the archives, and there have been studies and government panels that have been looking into this for certainly as long as California has had their low carbon fuel standard,
Oh,
which was,
interesting.
back around 2011 that kind of first started getting off the ground. And so, it was a bit of a long haul to get to where we are legislatively. But, I think the fact that California has had a program in place for over a decade now, British Columbia and Oregon have had programs in place for a number of years. And, the fact that we in Washington have seen, that the sky didn't fall, fuels in those states are not massively more expensive than they are here. And also that those states are really seeing an explosion of fuel choice for their
Mm.
consumers. You have much more biodiesel, renewable diesel, ethanol, electricity, hydrogen. In a way that we're not yet seeing here in Washington. I think was a big motivator for people. So yeah, that really paved the way for Washington. And finally in 2021, our clean fuel standard kind of got over the finish line legislatively.
Right, exactly, and I think that we have to reiterate the that we've seen the California LCFS program be shown as quote unquote successful. Right, there's a lot more of renewable fuels. There's a greater adoption of electric equipment out there, largely in part because of the LCFS, if not entirely because of it. And I think that it's also important to mention that these are big programs, big programs, especially in California, where it is producing billions of dollars of potential credit generation revenue for clean fuels and the consumption of electricity and hydrogen. So that said, these programs are a bit different. They were implemented in different times. Their credits themselves are not fungible between programs, and I think there's probably been some lessons learned in the development of your own regulation and things to change or add on to. Can you maybe, for someone that's maybe a little bit more well versed in California and Oregon, explain a handful of the differences between those programs and yours and what you've added to it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, I want to give credit where it's due and say that we could not be where we are today without the groundwork that was laid by California and Oregon. Both states have really done a ton of fundamental work, and California has really done the most in setting up the fundamentals of the program and then mentoring other states who want to come in and copy those or adapt them to make their own programs. So a major thanks to our colleagues at CARB down there for the support that they've given us. But, that said, of course, we have also wanted to learn from California's experience, optimize the program to Washington, and then, maybe advance a few new best practices. And, one of the key ways that I think we have really advanced the state of the policy here in Washington is around equity. So, transition to new transportation technology costs money. If you're talking about buying electric cars, even though those are cheaper to operate and maintain, they're more expensive to buy right now. You got all the charging infrastructure to install. Of course, you have similar things if you're looking at hydrogen or, even if you're looking at other alternative fuels, there's always a transition cost. And so, not everybody is going to have equal access or equitable access to that transition and to some of the cost savings and benefits that come from switching to alternative fuels. So there are a couple of things built into our policy that are designed to promote equality of access to electrified transportation. A couple of ones I want to highlight are, one, we're fairly directive in our program with what electric utilities can do with their credit revenue. Now, electric utilities primarily get their credits from residential charging of electric vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And so we then direct them on how to invest that credit revenue, and they have to spend 30% of that on transportation electrification in overburdened communities around the state. And then they're strongly encouraged to spend an additional 50% on ensuring equity of access to electrified transportation. And I'm using a really generic term there on purpose because, electrified transportation doesn't necessarily mean an electric car in every driveway.
Right.
Not everybody has a driveway. So I'm talking about buses, I'm talking about e-bikes and scooters, I'm talking about, shared vehicle services, anything like that. So, those are programs that we're really excited to see our electric utilities investing in. And a lot of our utilities here in Washington are pretty excited about that. And then one other policy I want to hit on real quick on this front is our backstop aggregator. This is a policy that we copied from the state of Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a nonprofit that we're going to contract with that will sweep up any of these residential electric vehicle charging credits that utilities don't claim. So, we give every utility in the state the opportunity to opt in and generate their credits. Not all of them choose to do that. And so we give all the credits that aren't claimed to the backstop aggregator, so they're not wasted. And then that backstop aggregator is specifically tasked with investing in electric transportation equity. So that's just another way that we're making sure that some of these credit revenues that at this point are really coming from the early adopters of electric vehicles, right? Are then going back into the communities that at least for now and probably for a few years into the foreseeable future are going to have less access to these technologies. We're making sure that those people are being given these additional opportunities to access them.
That's amazing. So it's kind of a little bit of a catch-all for the opportunities to ensure every dollar made available in this program can go to a community like that. I really love the message there and in the intent behind that kind of backstop provision like DEQ. It's something I think as these policies continue to march forward has continually rolled in as well. So separately, I think you guys had also established a new environmental justice department. Is that right as well?
Yeah, it's called the Environmental Justice Council, and that's something that we're also really excited about. That was created also in 2021, the same year as the Clean Fuel Standard statute. And so that's a state level kind of governing body that's tasked with kind of overseeing environmental justice direction and policy for the state. And a handful of state agencies, including Ecology, have been given some really specific directions to make environmental justice a priority in our rulemaking and in our grant making programs, all of our investments, to make sure that we're prioritizing these overburdened communities that frankly governments have ignored for a really long time. So it's sort of like the federal Justice 40 commitment, the requirement that the White House is having federal agencies invest 40% of their grant funds in overburdened communities. We're taking a similar approach here, but we're just saying that first priority goes into investing in these communities and that we need to take community input into account. So, what that's going to look like in our program is that we're working with our Ecology Office of Equity and Environmental Justice, which of course is tied in with that State Environmental Justice Council, to make sure that we are including community voices as we plan out like the work plan for our backstop aggregator and the ways that we're going to have our electric utilities invest their credit revenue, just to make sure that we're planning around the needs of communities and not making assumptions about what those are, but actually talking to people on the ground and figuring out how best to serve them.
That's great. And that's going to lead into, I think, a bit of our discussion at the end here where I'd like to tag on to really just why we're doing what we're doing and why these policies are being implemented in this way. But just kind of maintaining the theme a little bit about this interplay between states, especially on the liquid fuel side, because they're so related. There is a lot of fuel produced in other states that either end up in these states with clean fuel standards or fuel produced in those similar ones that are now being shipped across borders for purposes largely of participating in a clean fuel standard. So can you explain a little bit about how Washington is interplaying with Oregon and California in that way, or maybe even further expand on what you kind of market dynamics you expect from states outside of these ones out here on the West Coast?
So yeah, there are a bunch of participants in the Clean Fuel Standard programs on the West Coast that are not located in the states themselves. And so, when we're accounting for that life cycle carbon intensity of the fuels, we take that transport distance into account. So we look at the emissions it takes to get the fuel from, Iowa or Idaho or Oregon, wherever it comes from, into Washington. And so, right now, what a lot of fuel suppliers do is they look at where they're going to get the best incentive, and that's where they send their fuels. And so, case in point is we have a big biodiesel refinery located in Grace Harbor, Washington, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours southwest of Seattle on the coast. And a lot of their biodiesel goes down to California. Some of it goes to Oregon. Not a lot of it stays in Washington, and that's because they can get better incentives there. We would anticipate with the Clean Fuel Standard coming into effect in Washington that more of that fuel will stay local. We think that that's a win both for Washington, which is now getting more of the benefit of this renewable fuel production facility in the state. And also overall, we think it's a win for climate because it's obviously better off if fuel is produced closer to where it's used.
Right.
We're going to minimize those transport distances. And of course, that fuel is going to have a slightly better carbon intensity score if it's produced in Washington and used here than it is if it's going to go to California. Now, obviously, there's going to be a little bit of market effect, some arbitrage, which is just a way of saying that, if California's carbon intensity standard is more stringent than ours, which it is right now because their program's been around longer, And that incentive is a little better than the hit they take from the transport distance. It may still go to California, but we really think that bringing more states into this sort of family of clean fuel states that's currently Oregon, Washington, and California, and to some extent British Columbia, that's really going to just be good for everybody in this clean fuels ecosystem. That's going to incentivize more producers to produce more clean and renewable fuels, and those economies of scale are going to drive prices down.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think you touched on, the more of these programs that pop up, the more likely it is that a local refiner, a local producer is not going to ship or rail whatever they're producing to another state simply for the incentive itself. And so it seems like a snowball effect ultimately at the end of the day when these continue to go on. So it's kind of a separate question too. Again, kind of going back to the production of electricity here. So that's often a question that we field is, well, going EVs are great, but that electricity has to come from somewhere. So can you speak a little bit to kind of what you know about the power grid, the power generation across the state right now, and really if you see any forecasted changes on that coming down the line?
Yeah. So we're really fortunate here in Washington to have one of the cleanest power grids in the country. I live in Seattle, and if our local utility is to believe they're the cleanest utility in the country, they're something like 99% hydro. So that's really cool. It's not quite that high around the state, but we do have a really high percentage of hydro generation here, plus a lot of other renewables, and so the carbon intensity of our electricity is pretty low. That said, yeah, we actually know with some degree of certainty that our electricity is cleaning up over time, and that's because Washington passed a law a couple of years ago called the Clean Energy Transformation Act that requires our grid to go carbon-free over about the next 15, 20 years. And so basically, if we are transitioning transportation over to electricity, which of course, to be clear, is not something the Clean Fuel Standard requires, but is one of the main ways that people are going to generate credits and comply with the Clean Fuel Standard, that electricity is going to get cleaner over time, even if the people who are installing the EV chargers or operating the electric vehicles are not doing anything.
Yeah, exactly. Is that kind of how you see this transitionary period happening over the next 10, 15, 20, maybe 20 plus years? Is that there is a program here that helps incentivize lower carbon fuels in state, but ultimately at the down the road, as newer technologies are made available in the electrification sector, that those can be deployed, and simultaneously electrical grids themselves are cleaned up, and then hopefully at the end of the day that we have this nice 1-2 punch of clean fuel electricity and clean fuel consumer on the vehicle side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on a really important point, which is that the Clean Fuel Standard is one of a number of complementary policies that are all working together to try and bend our carbon emissions curve down towards zero. And so, cleaning up the grid while we're transitioning vehicles to electricity and other alternative fuels are two of those policies. And, I would add in there things like, we have a zero emission vehicle mandate, which is requiring increasing sales of zero emission vehicles up to 2035 when all new passenger vehicles are going to have to be zero emission. And a couple of other policies all working together. And the Clean Fuel Standard, its piece in all of that is that as the grid gets cleaner, the incentive for that electricity gets better. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's a big incentive both today and into the future to transition to electricity. Again, not required. You can transition to any lower carbon fuel, but electricity is one that's going to get better over time.
And is there also a book and claim process in this particular program? So even if somebody wanted to utilize a zero emission electricity resource, they have the ability to do that in the Washington program?
That's correct. Yep. We allow book and claim accounting for electricity and for renewable natural gas used as transportation fuel or as feedstock for producing hydrogen.
Ah, perfect. So just going back really quickly on some of those complementary policies. So you guys have, you had mentioned Cap and Invest at one point. You had Advanced Clean Cars, I think that particular one. Can you kind of touch on some of those particular programs? I know that you are involved with them as well, but kind of dig in a little bit more on what those complementary policies are and how it might relate to consumers out there.
Yeah, of course. So I'll start with Cap and Invest. So that's another program that was passed out of the legislature at the same time, also modeled after the complementary program in California, where they call it Cap and Trade, and started on January 1st of this year as well. Our Cap and Invest program also covers transportation fuels. And so the Cap and Invest program and the Clean Fuel Standard, as they apply to fuels, really work hand in glove. They're both incentivizing emissions reductions in the fuel space. And essentially, if a company reduces their emissions footprint because they're motivated by the clean fuel standard, that's going to lower their compliance costs with cap and invest, and vice versa. So there is really this kind of virtuous interaction between those two programs around the transportation fuel space. Of course, the cap and invest program is much broader than just transportation fuels. It covers just about every source in the state, emission source that has over 25,000 metric tons of emissions. Now, yeah, you also mentioned advanced clean cars, and that's what I mentioned, our zero emission vehicle sales mandate. It's a mandate on auto manufacturers to sell increasing percentages of zero emission vehicles in the state up through model year 2035. And in 2035, they have to sell 100% of new light duty vehicles as zero emission vehicles. And so that's just modeled after, in fact, adopting exactly the policy that's in place in California. Of course, Oregon, New York, and a handful of other states have also implemented those policies. Last I heard, that was about a third of the U.S. vehicle market. Mm-hmm. And so we think that that's one of the significant drivers behind major automakers announcing that they're transitioning over to 100% zero emissions kind of on the same time frame.
And a hot topic in California right now is advanced clean fleets. Is there a similar program in Washington? I mean, you guys have a large port communities at the ports of Seattle, Port of Tacoma, a lot of drayage. There's a lot of stuff going on around that. Is that, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, advanced clean fleets is, you could think of that as a heavy duty complement to the advanced clean cars. Of course, there's also advanced clean trucks, which is also a California rule that Washington has adopted. That also has increasing sales percentages for zero emission vehicles, and it's a little bit different by weight class. Advanced clean fleets kind of goes a step further and requires total electrification of a lot of the heavy duty and medium duty trucking sectors. This is where we kind of get into the funky nuance of the interplay between state and federal policy. So advanced clean fleets hasn't actually been adopted by California yet. Right. When it is adopted, then California can apply for a Clean Air Act waiver from the EPA. And if they're granted that waiver saying that, yes, EPA gives California the authority to have an emission standard more stringent than the Clean Air Act requires, then that allows other states like Washington to then either adopt the federal standard, which is the default, or the California standard. So long-winded way of saying, once California adopts advanced clean fleets, then that'll be an option for us here in Washington.
And to clarify, that waiver that California has to get approved is a recurring theme. That's something they've had to do in the past and are expected to be able to do again in the future. It's kind of what allows for the state to set their own emission reduction goals for vehicles, on-road vehicles, and a myriad of other things already, right?
That's correct. Yep, this is something that California has done dozens of times in the past. Anytime they pass a new standard that exceeds the federal Clean Air Act requirements, then they apply for a waiver. Typically, EPA grants those, and then that becomes an option for the other states.
Right. California's long been known for funding mechanisms also. I mean, these are, mandates that are in place, but they know they don't want to leave everyone up the creek here. And so there are a myriad of other funding mechanisms out and available for, especially on the heavy duty side. But can you maybe explain or speak to whether similar style things also are made available in Washington?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I meant to touch on that when I talked about the cap and invest program earlier. I kind of talked about the cap side and forgot about the other major piece, which is the invest part,
the nice part.
Which it turns out is critically important and the part everybody likes much more. So we're estimating that program is going to generate very roughly in the neighborhood of about $500 million a year in revenue, and that is all going to get reinvested in the state in things like decarbonizing transportation, in climate resilience, in projects on tribal lands, and there's a whole list of things in the bill. So yeah, that's going to be a big source of funding to invest in some of these transitions, especially if you're looking in the medium and heavy duty trucking space. The cost differentials between an internal combustion vehicle and a zero emission vehicle can be pretty large. And in a lot of cases, the charging infrastructure or the fueling infrastructure is not really well built out yet. So, plans are still coming together on a lot of that. For example, we have just a brand newly formed Interagency Electric Vehicle Coordinating Council, which is a cross-government body at the state level that's charged with coming up with a plan for basically how do we transition all transportation in the state of Washington to zero emissions. We obviously have a lot of policies in place, but, the legislature felt like it was important to have a steering committee tasked with doing that work. So, we have things like that, and then we have the legislature with this $500 million a year to invest in the transition. So yeah, we're expecting a lot more funding to creep up at the state level, and of course that dovetails really nicely with the federal funding that's been coming out from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. So yeah, a lot of exciting funding going on in the space, and we expect to see some really significant changes in the transportation system in the coming years as a result.
And icing on the cake is the clean fuel standard, right? So, as I understand it, these are market based programs. These are credits that are sold to regulated parties, and those are not state or any other sort of public funds. And so, when someone is able to utilize a fund for transit buses, that same entity can also apply, get in, and utilize funds from the clean fuel standard to kind of continue this movement forward. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, once somebody gets their grant from the state to convert to, an electric bus, to use your example, then yeah, the clean fuel standard is kind of a deal sweetener for them, and that, that grant money goes away after they buy the bus and install the charging infrastructure, but then the clean fuel standard revenue that they're getting for charging up that bus every day is something that's going to go on into the future.
And in perpetuity, right? So it's a program that just is cyclical like the others, right? Every quarter, they're able to continue leveraging based on the energy consumption they have on hand.
Yeah, that's right. And as their energy gets cleaner, the incentive is going to go up. Now, of course, also the carbon intensity standard is going to get more stringent every year, right? And so, that could drive down how much incentive they get. But presumably, as the electricity gets cleaner, even as the standard is going down, that's going to keep those incentives high. But it also provides everybody an incentive to reduce their emissions.
Right. So Joel, we got to cut it loose here pretty soon, but you're an eloquent guy. One thing I really wanted to touch base on is kind of again why we're doing this. A lot of people look at programs like this and they don't really understand the complication between these very in-depth regulations, and they look at it as kind of like another compliance obligation. Sometimes they are, but there are often very meaningful reasons why we're doing this. I love the elements that you guys have baked into equity into your particular programs, but can you just riff on that for a little bit, kind of talk about why we're really implementing these types of policies and how beneficial they ultimately are?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. So, there are a lot of reasons why. The top level reason, of course, is climate change, right? Washington has really strict emissions reduction targets that are set in statute. So we're required to reduce 45% below 1990 levels by 2030. So, that's coming right up, and that's a steep reduction. And transportation is our biggest source of emissions. So, that's reason number one why we've implemented this policy. But, as you touched on before, there are also a lot of really important equity and environmental justice reasons why we're doing this work. So, of course, vehicles, and especially medium and heavy duty vehicles, are a significant source of pollution. And it's a lot of overburdened communities, people of color, vulnerable populations that live near our ports and near our major roadways and our airports and our railroads. So these are the people who are subject to the majority of these emissions. And so as we clean up our transportation sector, those are the groups of people that are disproportionately experiencing the benefits of these policies. So we're trying to rein in climate change here, but a really, really important co-benefit to that is that we're cleaning up air quality and making some of our lower income Washingtonians, some of our people of color, some of our overburdened communities have improved air quality, which is really pretty exciting.
Yeah, and not to mention some of the just financial business benefits as well. I mean, this is a fuel security question for a lot of people too, and not to mention a TCO analysis that a lot of people are conducting. So really a myriad of good benefits out of this and a lot of other programs in Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're super excited about the fact that, if gas prices go up in the future and we have, a dozen different fuel options, people can just shrug and plug in their electric car and go about their day and, really not worry about it too much. So yeah, I think it has some real economic security implications as well, as it gives people, some stability against price shocks and, and even inflation that's driven when energy costs spike, as we've seen them do.
Right. Well, there's a lot to learn about this program. As you mentioned, it has just kicked off. We are in day 20 of this entire thing. There's a lot to learn internally for you, I'm sure, but of course, externally for people looking in. So where's the best resource for people to go look at if they need to understand a little bit more? How do they research this? How do they contact someone if they need to? Where would someone go from here?
Yeah, thanks for the plug. So we have a great website, ecology.wa.gov/CFS. And so there's a whole ton of information on there. And equally importantly, that's where our email address is. And so feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions. We have a whole team of people that is there to answer everybody's questions and help facilitate people's participation in the program. So we're really excited to talk to people and help them figure out how they can participate.
Fantastic. Well, Joel, thank you very much for your hard work on this. Also, thank you to the Department of Ecology for allowing you to come on today. I will say I am glad you're not researching mercury anymore and are very invested in this particular work. So congratulations on the launch, and very excited to see what comes of it.
Well, thanks so much, Todd. This was a lot of fun.
Great. As Joel mentioned, we'll put some of those links and some other resources for you in our show notes. But until then, thank you for tuning into the Charge Cycle. We will catch you next time, and get out there and get plugged in.